Victorian jails were miserable, fortress-like buildings, where punishment was forefront and rehabilitation an unknown word. For men and women alike, a prisoner's time behind bars was a tough and strictly regimented existence of early wake-up calls, hard, laborious work, interspersed by exercise, often in strict silence, and breaks for meals. On the other side of the bars, the life of a prison guard was challenging, working long hours and dealing with abuse and physical attacks by prisoners. Today, in an account of prison life in the 1880s, told by a contemporary government employee, you will discover what it was like for Victorian women to be held in London's Brixton and Millbank jails, particularly the character of those incarcerated. He gathered first-hand observations from prison officers, matrons, the female equivalent of wardens, and, of course, the prisoners themselves. This is the next episode to a video you can watch on this channel about daily life in women's prisons, which also has more information on the history of Brixton and Millbank jails. See the link in the description. Find out how harsh conditions turned women to such anger that they tore up their cells and attempted to escape, and what the cruel and barbarous dark was, being the fate of disruptive women who broke the rules. You will also discover that this was a place of intrigue and espionage, where matrons were devious in getting their colleagues dismissed so they could get promotion, and those fresh to the job were wise not to antagonize the inmates. For, if they did, they'd have to continually watch their backs, for they might not get out alive. Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you'd like to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us continue bringing the past alive. I should be sorry to cast any undue romantic interest over the characters of female prisoners, although it will be presently my duty to direct a little attention to certain of these women whose lives have had as much romance in them as most people's. And, indeed, that is not to be wondered at, when it is considered what a tempest-tossed life a woman's must have been to have brought her to this dark estate. But they are not all heroines mourning over the error of their ways, and the faltering downward steps that led them to an abyss of crime, and left them there, albeit they may all be women we can pity. Charles Dickens, in one of his Christmas works, asserts eloquently that, however low they may have fallen, they grasp still in their hands some tufts and shreds of that unfenced precipice from which they fell from good, and that not to pity them is to do wrong to heaven and man, to time and to eternity, and it is even possible, however deceptive outward appearances may be, that they all retain in their memory some fragmentary yearnings for the better past, the brighter days of their innocence and youth. But to see some of these women hour by hour, and listen to them in their mad defiance, rage and blasphemy, almost constrains one to believe that they are creatures of another mould and race, born with no idea of God's truth, and destined to die in their own benighted ignorance. As a class, they are desperately wicked, deceitful, crafty, malicious, lewd, and void of common feeling, with their various temperaments. There are various ways of humouring them into obedience, and sometimes a chance of inducing them to act and think judiciously. But it can be readily imagined that all the vices under the sun are exemplified in these hundreds of women, with but a sparse sprinkling of those virtues which should naturally adorn and dignify womanhood. In the penal classes of the male prisons, there is not one man to match the worst inmates of our female prisons. There are some women so wholly and entirely bad that chaplains give them up in despair. Prison rules prove failure, and punishment has no effect, save to bring the prisoners to death's door, on the threshold of which their guilty tongues still curse and revile. And one must let them have their way, or see them die. Some women are less easy to tame than the creatures of the jungle, and one is almost sceptical of believing that they have ever known an innocent childhood or a better life. And yet, strange as it may appear, these women are not always in for the worst crimes. There are few, if any, murderesses amongst them. They have been chiefly convicted of theft after theft, accompanied by violence, and they are satanically proud of the offences that have brought them within the jurisdiction of the law. In the prison, the teaching that should have begun with the women in their girlhood is commenced, and exercises, in a few instances, a salutary influence. But ignorance, deep besotting ignorance, is the characteristic of almost every fresh woman on whom the key turns in her cell. It keeps our prisons full, our judges always busy. 3/4 of our prisoners before their conviction were unable to read a word, had no knowledge of the Bible or what was in it, had never heard of a Saviour, and only remembered God's name as coupled with a curse. Some women have been trained to be thieves, and worse than thieves, by their mothers, taking their lessons in crime with a regularity and a persistence that, turned to better things, would have made them loved and honoured all their lives. They have been taught all that was evil, and the evil tree has flourished and borne fruit. It is the hardest task to train so warped and distorted a creation the right and fitting way. Praise be to those hard-working, unflinching prison chaplains, who strive their utmost and are not always unsuccessful, who have occasionally the true repentance of one sinner to counterbalance the 99 who scoff at all contrition, and do not, will not understand, to use their own terms, what the parsons are driving at. One of the most embarrassing positions for a well-educated prisoner, a lady thief or swindler, is to mix with these kinds of women. It is an additional torture to her punishment, for which she is wholly unprepared. They do not understand her or her ways at Brixton Prison. Where there was association, they would sometimes shun her. There are times even when, singularly enough, they taunt her with her education. "You has learnt better than us, and shouldn't have come here," a woman once said. Cleaning their cells and scrubbing the stones appear the hardest trials. "Oh dear," a lady prisoner remarked over this kind of labour, "will this do, miss, or shall I try to scrub a little harder?" "I think I can." To hear some of the prisoners' excuses for their appearance in prison would almost induce one to believe in that disease of kleptomania which has been lately talked about, or in some familiar demon or tempter constantly at these poor creatures' elbows, to suggest the profitable nature of sin and the vanity of all that is upright and honourable. A returned woman, that is, a woman who has been let out on her ticket of leave, and has forfeited it by her misconduct, or who has been reconvicted, perhaps under a false name, always asserts that it wasn't to be avoided. Something made her seek out her old pals, or steal her neighbour's goods again. "I did try very hard, miss," she will sometimes say to the matron who may be interested in her. And if she believes in that interest, the matron has more power over her and more influence with her than the chaplain. "I did try very hard, but it wasn't to be. I was obliged to steal, or to watch someone there was a chance of stealing from. I did try my best, but it couldn't be helped. And here I am. It wasn't my fault exactly, because I did try, you see, miss." There are other prisoners not so frank, and these prisoners form the majority, who stoutly maintain, to the last, their innocence of the crime for which they are incarcerated. However indisputable may have been the proofs alleged against them, they are always ill-used unfortunates, who have been made the victims of a foul conspiracy to place them in durance vile. They will assert these fabrications to chaplain, superintendent, matrons, and to each other, with a cool effrontery that no facts can diminish, and will quarrel upon the point amongst themselves occasionally. And though each is firm to her own story, she believes not a word of anybody else's. That Ball, or that Matthews, was always such a liar. Of the vanity and the mischievous tricks of prison life I will not speak here. They exemplify so many singular traits of character that they deserve to be treated at greater length. It is sufficient to say that the majority of women are inordinately vain and incorrigibly mischievous. The most trying ordeal for all prisoners is that of probation, the silent system, as it may almost be termed, that it is simply impossible to make the female prisoners conform to strictly silent rules, or to any rules, for a length of time. all officers of female prisons will bear me out in. There are a restlessness and excitability in the character of these women that make the charge of them infinitely more of a labour and a study than the management of treble the number of men. The male prisoners are influenced by some amount of reason and forethought, but the female prisoner flies in the face of prudence, and acts more like a madwoman than a rational, reflecting human being. Those who are cunning enough to carry on, by signs and looks and tappings on the wall, a correspondence with their neighbours, are less refractory than those of less experience in evading prison rules. Many women, in defiance of a day or two's bread and water, will suddenly shout across the airing yard, or from one cell to another, with a noise all the more vehement for the long restraint to which they have been subjected, and such a proceeding, if remonstrated with, is generally followed by a smashing of windows and a tearing up of sheets and blankets, that will often affect half a ward with a similar mania, if the delinquent is not speedily carried off to refractory quarters. It has been long observed that the force of example, in the matter of breakings out, is sure to be strikingly exemplified, that for the sake of change even, and for that excitement which appears to be part of their being, without which they must go melancholy mad. 2 or 3 women will, in a quiet, aggravating manner, arrange for a systematic smashing of windows and tearing of sheets and blankets. Women will address their matrons in a style similar to the following. "Miss G, I am going to break out tonight." "Oh, nonsense. You won't think of any such folly, I'm sure." Persuasion is generally attempted first, as a breaking out disturbs a whole prison for a day or two. "I'm sure I shall, then." "What for?" "Well, I've made up my mind. That's what for. I shall break out tonight. See if I don't." "Has anyone offended you or said anything?" No, but I must break out. It's so dull here. I'm sure to break out." "And then you'll go to the dark." "I want to go to the dark," is the answer. If a matron really believes the woman's determination to break out, the prisoner is taken to the dark at once. Dark cells were used for solitary confinement, and the breaking out often occurs as promised. The glass shatters out of the window frames. Strips of sheets and blankets are passed through or left in a heap in the cell. The guards are sent for, and there is a scuffling, and fighting, and scratching, and screaming that pandemonium might equal. Nothing else. These breaking out women are naturally the most difficult class to deal with, as already observed. Severe measures effect but little good, and any humouring or sign of fear gives the woman the mastery at once. It is here the superintendent's judicious care is required, and the gentle but firm remonstrance of an educated woman often produces a good impression upon the listener. It was observed by the late Sir Joshua Jebb that the most refractory prisoner is not of necessity the worst woman, a remark which was erroneously attributed to Mrs. Gibson by a writer in the Cornhill magazine, who asserted that it was the exact converse of what he had heard from sagacious men in all prisons, and from Mr. Partridge, secretary of the Discharged Prisoners' Aid Society. Still, though it does not follow that the most refractory woman is the worst character of the penal class, yet there are some of the worst women amongst that number. But there are 2 classes of refractory women, if not more. There is a sullen, dogged, vindictive prisoner who nurses her fancied wrongs and breaks out on principle, and from whose resolution no prayers or protestations will distract her. And there is the fiery-tempered, refractory, who, taking offence at a sharp word, or when smarting under a sudden sense of injury or jealousy, goes madly to work at everything breakable and terrible within range at the moment. The latter nature, which is quick to resent offence, is often as quickly sensible to kindness, and, therefore, a kind and judicious treatment will frequently exercise a vast amount of good. Still, such treatment must be of the most delicate kind, and, above all, favouritism must be avoided, for, in studying one too much, 50 others will fall away, or seek to render themselves bad imitations of her. Also, they are keen observers, and great mimics, these prisoners, and are not slow to profit by any ruse that will promote their interests, advance them nearer to the second and first class, make them badge women and kitchen women, or add a little more to the gratuities which are waiting for them when their term of service has expired. The breakings out are not always instances of violent ebullitions of temper, but are actuated by a craving for change, if that change be even to the dark cells, or for anything that will tend to relieve the monotony of existence. Occasionally, at Millbank, in troublous times, when the dark cells were known to be already occupied, women would break their windows, strike, or attempt to strike, their officers, for company's sake, knowing that they must have a companion for a day or two, and a companion, even with bread and water by way of diet, was better than silent existence under separate confinement. The dark cells have been long secretly acknowledged failures. Confinement in these cells was an objectionable punishment. It affected the prisoner's health, it never worked any good, and it did much moral, physical, and even mental injury. It has always appeared, in my eyes, a relic of the old barbarous times, the little-minded style of punishment, as childish in one sense as it was cruel in another. There are women more difficult to manage than those refractory prisoners, cunning and treacherous women, ever on the alert to take a matron off her guard or lead another prisoner into trouble. These are the sly, crafty natures that have no good feelings to be worked upon, that may be observant of all prison rules for years, and then attempt the life of anyone to whom they have long borne a grudge. Women with murderous thoughts, who will hide scissors or jagged pieces of stone, that very mysteriously find their way into the prison and are surreptitiously used by the women to clean the flagstones in the wards. The prisoners are quick to take advantage of new officers and lay traps to lead them into some minor breach of rules, involving a fine of half a crown or 5 shillings, and occasionally summary dismissal from the service. Women with the cunning of him who deceived our mother Eve. Then there are the flighty women, the half-mad or wholly mad, who require some careful observation to make sure they are not acting, and who are at last taken away and are heard of no more. It may be remarked, as a curious fact, that the prisoners are always the most ill-behaved at Christmas time. At Brixton Prison, it was remarkable that the dark cells were always full on Christmas Day. I have often wondered whether there were any past associations connected with that time to render the mind restless and excitable. As an instance of some rough sense of justice and good feeling amongst the general body of female prisoners, the following incident, that occurred once at Millbank Prison, may be considered interesting. At Millbank, the rules were stringent, and, it may be frankly confessed, not always rigidly observed. Little variations on the original rules had gradually crept in, and become almost rules in themselves. Now and then the variations were improvements upon the original idea, and so were tacitly allowed to stand. Each matron, it must be understood, selected a well-behaved prisoner, for a week or fortnight, to attend to her private room in the ward, and this woman was charged for a second, third, or fourth, according to the turn. Much trust was placed in the prisoner, and very often there was much good faith between her and the matron. It has often happened that a careless officer has left her drawers unlocked, a little trinket, ring, brooch, or earring on her toilet table, and these acts of forgetfulness were more often the occasion of illustrating the prisoner's honest service than otherwise. Occasionally, of course, a brooch or ring disappeared and was heard of no more. But, as a rule, anything readily purloinable was generally left untouched by the woman in attendance. There were some women so thoroughly honest in this respect that they might be implicitly confided in. Naturally, then, the matrons had their favourite women, and in the instance to which I allude a woman has been kept a longer time than usual in attendance, to the chagrin of other prisoners, as anxious for a little variety to their occupation, if not as equally deserving. Strangely enough, however, it was not a prisoner who reported the matron, but a new and very inexperienced assistant matron, anxious to demonstrate to the authorities her knowledge of the rules, possibly her sense of what was strictly just. The matron was summoned before the governor of the prison and suspended from office for a certain period, a sentence that, appearing to the fair delinquent extremely harsh and oppressive, considering her offence but the infraction of a rule that had long been more honoured in the breach than the observance, led to her impetuous resignation of an appointment which she had filled for some years with tact and judgment. The resignation was accepted, the matron quitted the prison, and the story circulated amongst the prisoners with that celerity which has often perplexed the authorities as to their means of information. The matron who had departed was a favourite among the prisoners, and the assistant matron's sense of justice was set down by these rapidly calculating minds to a very different feeling. From the day the news circulated through the prison that the matron had resigned, that assistant matron was a mark of scorn and derision to every woman in the wards over which the favourite officer had exercised control. Her orders were disobeyed, in defiance of all authority. Women rushed at her to strike her. Her chance appearance in the airing yard, on which the windows of the cells looked, was the signal one day for the general appearance of the women at their windows, hissing, yelling, and reviling with a vehemence that alarmed the whole prison, and necessitated the withdrawal of the assistant for a few days from active duty. But prisoners have tenacious memories. On the assistant's reappearance, the same supreme contempt for her was exhibited, and one morning, when the women had been marshalled into chapel and were awaiting the chaplain's arrival, a sudden rush of prisoners was made upon the unfortunate object of their anger, and it was only timely assistance that prevented serious injuries befalling her. So persistent, indeed, were the prisoners to take up the cudgels in defence of their matron, and the presence of that particular assistant matron tended so much to the subversion of all discipline that it became necessary to remove her from government service. Women really diligent, anxious to conform to prison rules, and having some sense of shame at the ignominy of their position, there are some of these characters to leaven a mass of unpliable material, have many little chances of getting on in the present and doing well in the future. There are breaks in the monotony of their existence, letter-writing days, if they are able to write, and, if not able, they are at liberty to dictate to a woman who can. No dictation, save to the schoolmistress, was allowed at Millbank. However, all letters at prisons are seen by the chaplain's clerk, or some other officer, before leaving the prison, and all letters received for prisoners are opened and read by the superintendent's clerk. Days of schooling, days of extra duty out of their cell, in attendance on a matron, days of association, or palling in, as they used to term it at Brixton prison, days of seeing directors to make remonstrances or solicit extra favours, days of seeing the surgeon about their little ailments. Some of these advantages are, of course, open to the ill-behaved as well as the well-disciplined, and however frivolous the plea, any woman can demand to see the doctor or the directors. It is a right and privilege, and there are many who, taking undue advantage of it, become no small nuisance to the authorities. Of the days most trying to all prisoners are those approaching the time when the locks shall be unfastened, the doors swung wide, and the world once again shall lie before them, where to choose. Days verging on the glorious freedom for which they have pined and fretted and prayed for years, and yet which they will grow so awfully indifferent to, as to give them up for a new sentence, and the old miserable life before their liberty, perhaps, is 3 months old. Excitable, dreamlike days these are to the prisoners, days of a confused sense of real and unreal, under which some thoughtful prisoner, with her heart full of going home, will make strange blunders. Days so excitable that some prisoners will go mad over them, and smash their windows, tear up their needlework, after the old frenzied manner, and go back to punishment for the last time, nay, have been, to my knowledge, liberated from the dark, and passed hence to the free air and sunshine, possibly all the more enjoyable for the vivid contrast presented by their late position. But these are exceptional cases. As a rule, the women are well behaved in the latter days. nervous and confused, proud of the envy with which their companions regard them, but respectful and obedient to all the prison officers. They are most of them going to reform, to lead good lives in the future, to give up all the past associates, whose company and vile example led them astray when they were younger, and had less experience of life, and less knowledge of the difference between right and wrong. Some of them are really imbued with the best intentions, and proceed from prison to the Prisoners' Aid Society. But others have already sketched out a plan of the old life, with the difference, which is to keep them from the clutch of a police officer. Some women whose expiration of sentence occurs at, or nearly at, the same period of time, arrange a place of meeting and a plan of living by theft, or on those cruel streets wherein, we are told, wander after nightfall, in one city alone, at least 40,000 erring women. On the day of liberty, women who live in the country are conducted to the railway station, seen into the railway carriage by a prison matron, and their fare paid by government to the station nearest home. If they are resident in London, a matron accompanies them home, and with a few parting words leaves them with their friends. All this is wise, generous, and merciful, and reflects the highest credit on those who framed this portion of our prison rules. While there is amidst these rules a little to complain of, there is also much to applaud, much evidence of a consideration for the future welfare of society's offscourings. The satirist has a sneer upon his lip when he terms ours a paternal government, but it has a fatherly interest in its misguided children, and the satirist is not always in the right. The women, however bad or however different their ultimate intentions, conform to this rule of the authorities. I can remember but one instance where a woman refused to be given over to her friends in London, and was left at the prison gates to proceed her own way. As an instance of good feeling, I may add that one woman whose gratuity, after long service, only amounted to £1, the damage done by prisoners in breaking out being deducted from the money they earn, sent 15 shillings worth of boots, etc., back to the prison, as a present for one with whom she had palled in, to be given her on the day of her discharge. From her loving sister, the packet was labelled, to avoid the rule which allows no presents from a discharged prisoner to another in captivity, and the boots, etc., were delivered in due course. The heroine of this little anecdote turned up again within a month of her release and told the story for herself, with much complacency, and with considerable exultation at having done the authorities. Some of these departures are a little trying to the matrons and other officers. A stoical firmness is hard to assume when a woman has really resolved on a new mode of life, and is departing, sanguine as to her success in the future. The day before her departure, she has an interview with the lady superintendent, who is generally the first to apprise her that her time is up. The prisoner is aware of it herself, to the hour and minute, and that the warrant for her release has been received from the office of the Secretary of State. This interview over, the woman returns to her cell to whisper to her old companions all that the superintendent has told her, and of the good wishes and the warnings she has given her. The next day, the chaplain sees her, to make his last effort for her soul's sake. There is the friendly goodbye, the present of Bible, hymn book, and prayer book. Then follow the last look round the old cell, the more wistful glance at the matron who has been kind to her, the impulsive or the shy, hesitative stretching forth of the hand towards that officer. It may be against the rules, no matter. The last wishes of the matron, and then, with many to bid her Godspeed, she passes from the prison into the air and sunshine, a free woman.